Please hold whilst we connect you to Redacted.
This is Fraser Greenfield.
And Louis Mills.
This is Robert Thorpe.
This is Rhys Kaunda-McKenzie.
And you're listening to Redacted.
Holding out as the last great bulwark of Australian automotive design, GoMotiv, a dedicated studio within the Outer Space Design Group, is a car design studio based mostly in the heart of Melbourne, Australia, with outposts in San Diego and Shanghai. Today, we managed to get GoMotiv Director Robert Thorpe and Rhys Kaunda-McKenzie, the Manager of Digital Sculpting and Visualisation, in to find out how they breathe new life into a dying art. And also, what it takes to give a car a soul.
First of all, we'd love you to introduce yourselves.
I'm Robert Thorpe, the Director of GoMotiv Studio. We're an independent studio based in Melbourne.
Fantastic.
I'm the Digital Sculpting Manager and Visualisation Manager for GoMotiv. My background's predominantly as an A-class surface modeler.
Yeah, wow. And Rob, could you tell us some of your background before GoMotiv and Outer Space as well?
Mechanical engineering background, my degree. But found my way into Holden probably in the early 2000s and spent 17 years with General Motors. So moved around various different roles from planning, advanced planning, and found my way into design. And that's where I really found my passion. Design at Holden was just amazing. A lot of the skill sets there that the team had was just incredible. After a period of time, moved to California and was Associate Director at the General Motors Advanced Design Studio over there for the last 6 years of my career with GM, and then moved back to Australia in 2019. Decided to leave the auto industry, try and do that, but I think automotive gets in your blood. The vision was to create a studio in Australia, and so that's where we started.
So wait, take us back a step. You're originally a mechanical engineer. What was that magic meet-cute moment where you're like, actually, I should be married to design?
Well, I went through mechanical engineering, and I won't lie, it was a struggle to get through. I think I got through 2 years and I'm like, I think I'm doing the wrong course. But then I realized, look, I'm so close to finishing, and I moved through. I knew roughly my passion did lie with cars. Never expected to get a gig at Holden, and that was just an amazing break for me. It was just awesome. And then I was lucky enough to work with some great people in marketing and then in forward planning and then advanced planning, and got exposed to the whole business. Finding a space within design was great. And then I moved into the program management space there, eventually into operations, and then eventually working with studios in China, and then eventually into the California role as well.
Did they make you reskill or anything when you moved into that design role?
I don't sketch. I'm not a sketcher. My whole role in life is to enable great design. There's a lot of chaos going on in car design, and I think being able to help in that regard, it's something that gets me out of bed every day. So in terms of pulling together a functional studio, it's something that I feel like I've sort of been built for.
Just to give us an idea of a car design studio, when you say like it can be pretty chaotic, is it because there's so many people or so many different skill sets?
No, it's not so much the number of people in the studio. Every day you're dealing with probably thousands of different pieces of criteria or input or direction, and that may be things that we already know about where we want to enable a particular surface or theme. We've got a theme direction we want to execute, those sort of things. Or it could be regulatory requirements that are coming at us that the client may not know about, but our studio engineering team has identified. And we've got to build all of those little pieces of criteria into building that beautiful surface. The trick is in the type of automotive studio, people have to be built to cope with a large amount of change and sometimes some very difficult problems in terms of executing surface that not everyone would probably be comfortable with. So that's the type of chaos that I'm talking about. But with that, there actually comes a lot of energy as well. So that's the exciting part of it. When you're actually getting in and solving those problems and enabling that design and getting some really great cars out through the studio, that's the exciting part of it. Helps you get out of bed every day and come in and do it. So yeah.
When you talk about chaos, especially to you, Rhys, as someone looking from the outside in, car designers do sketches, somebody makes some magic, and then we get a big 3D model which turns into a real car. What does that process actually look like?
Different scales, that's going to look a little bit differently. GoMotiv, we're a digital-focused studio, so we don't do the traditional clay model. Clay model is a big part of the typical OEM process in designing a car. We can start at that level and then whittle our way down to our process. At a high level, basically what happens is we have designers who come in, do the two-dimensional sketches typically. Some designers dabble in 3D as well, but it's often a much looser concept. From that two-dimensional sketch, we start to bring it into the three-dimensional form. That's what digital sculptors typically handle. But a part of that is then also engineers who provide criteria. So the restrictions on what needs to happen in order to enable that vehicle to actually go and be made or manufactured and be safe and everything else that goes into a car. So we have these like 3 departments: designers, digital sculptors, and engineers at a high level, or sculptors, I would say, at a high level. And then that process just goes through constant refinement and iteration to develop that vehicle, that math model, to a point where we can send it off to a supplier or a manufacturer to start making the actual vehicle from that math model.
So you're telling me you don't just sit around and draw cool cars every day?
Part of the process, but it's much more complex.
My entire career dream has just been shattered in seconds.
Pretty much you're always working from a course-defined process. Initially, you've got big pieces of criteria you're working with. And then as you move through, those pieces of criteria are getting even more and more finite as you work through. And the trick is to get through that process. At the start of the process, you've got your sketch and your vision model. But the trick is to get through that course-defined process. And at the end, you've got a model that represents pretty much exactly what you started out with.
This is Robert Thorpe.
This is Rhys Kaunda-McKenzie.
And you're listening to
And you're listening to
Redacted.
I think we might have glossed past it, but how did you discover the field of automotive design, Rhys? Was it something that you always were driven to get into, or did you discover it on your journey?
I started out at Monash as an industrial designer, doing the Bachelor of Industrial Design. And it was sort of a case of I wasn't actually particularly interested in automotive design when I initially joined. I knew Monash had a strong history of that, but I was more interested in the product design side of industrial design. And I ended up in a class that was being taught by some digital sculptors from General Motors at the time. And through that experience of being in that class and being mentored through that digital sculpting process, fell in love with that modeling process and what we would call A-class surfacing process.
Is that Alias?
Alias is probably one of the more well-known pieces of software, and that's what was being taught at Monash. Monash was actually unique in that regard, in that they were, I think, the only Australian university teaching Autodesk Alias, and that was because of that close relationship to General Motors Holden at the time. They had a partnership with GM. They had a few programs running for students. I wasn't involved in those, but through that program and being able to interact with people in industry made me find that I had this passion for doing 3D modeling. And through that, the then at time digital sculpting manager came in to the studio just to say hi and look at everybody's work. And through just a brief chat with him, he encouraged me to apply for an intern position. I wasn't actually considering it at the time. It wasn't even on my radar. He liked what I had been doing, and it was such a nice chat that I decided, why not? I'll just apply. I don't know if I'll get in, and it led to getting that internship and jumping into GM Holden initially.
I think a lot of people will get into design because they want to design cars, but then they find out the industry is so competitive and then they choose a different direction. But you've sort of gone the opposite way, which I find is quite interesting and probably a rare case.
From my perspective anyway, I don't think you need to love cars to be doing that sort of work. I think you just need to be passionate about the work that you're doing. And I think that's what drives a lot of people. I will say at most OEMs, you're finding a lot of very passionate car people.
Rhys, what car do you drive?
I drive a 2007 Honda CR-V, nothing high-end. For me, it's about the passion in the digital sculpting aspect of being able to bring those surfaces to life. And automotive industry, transport industry just in general, offers a unique opportunity to do a type of 3D modeling that you don't really see outside of that industry. It's very expressive and it's very technical at the same time. So you're sort of mixing that passionate element of being a designer with that more technical aspect, because we're merging that. We're taking that two-dimensional sketch, which is very expressive, and we're pulling it over the very technical aspects of an engineering model. So that job and role of being a digital sculptor is a blend between the two. I find the people who are passionate are maybe not the full creatives, but they're also the people who may be a little bit more technical minded at the same time. They have that crossover where they find that passion between blending between both elements at the same time.
Hey everyone, this episode sponsored by PCBWay, the go-to destination for printed circuit board prototyping, low-volume production, and PCB assembly. If your team is working on electronics and you're in need of a prototype PCB, I can't recommend PCBWay enough. You can get a quote instantly, even if your circuit board schematics aren't finished yet. They can also help you with injection molded, 3D printed, sheet metal, and vacuum cast prototypes. PCBWay is the circuit board prototyper of choice for companies like Samsung, Siemens, Honeywell, Tesla, and Apple. But you don't have to be a big company to use their services. I've personally used their services to instantly get quotes and have had prototype PCBs delivered in a timely manner. On top of all of that, PCBWay is offering us a special discount just for our listeners. When you get a quote from PCBWay, be sure to use our promo code REDACTED for a special discount on us. You can find PCBWay in our episode description or go to pcbway.com.
Just taking a step back, you decided to start your own automotive studio. What did that process look like and what was the seed that started it all?
When I arrived back in Australia, I started work at Outer Space Design, which has obviously been around for a long time, very respected. And after a period of time chatting with Fred, the founder, we had a bit of a vision to create a studio here in Australia. At the time, what we were seeing was there are a lot of new car companies being enabled through technology, moving to electric vehicles.
For reference, what year was this?
This was probably towards the end of 2019, start of 2020. So a lot of new entries coming into the market, and we were also sort of seeing that unique design was not really being put forward on a lot of the new brands. A lot of the new brands are looking the same.
And when you say new brands, we're thinking like Geely, the revival of MG, some other ones that you might give examples for?
Not necessarily those brands, but there are a lot of brands that we're seeing out of Asia coming out and even in North America coming out, where the opportunity to actually provide a different level of service to those clients was there. So what we are trying to do for our clients is establish brand identity that will differentiate them from the crowd, but also styling that is exciting and aspirational as well. Not just handsome styling that's good for today, but something that has actually got a bit of reach and a bit of stretch in it that will define their brand moving forward. We felt that the time was right for a few reasons. One was because the clients were potentially needing it, but also, I guess, at the time, we saw that the auto industry in Australia has got some very amazing, talented people. But if the studios that were here in Australia did downsize, there would be no place in Australia for those people. We'd lose the talent, and that smart end of design would effectively leave Australia. So the whole idea was to establish a studio here that actually could compete globally for full vehicle concept design and production design, using the talent that's here. And also on the flip side, servicing global clients, but also servicing local Australian clients as well and helping them create products that are going to be very well received in other markets.
So everyone loves a good underdog story. How did you find that first big automotive client?
The first client, that was a really interesting time. And as I said before, we are really targeting full vehicle design. So we were never just wanting to design one element of the car, really trying to actually go after the whole car. Justin Thompson's our creative director and Rhys Kaunda-McKenzie, our digital design manager. We've got quite well-established networks globally. and worked out that some of our networks were working in other car companies that were just starting out or didn't have a full design department, and maybe were using some of the services of the European design companies such as Farina Retail Design, Torino Design. Using those networks, we managed to get a break. Our first break was to sketch 2D concepts for a vehicle, and we're up against the established Italian studios. And the team that we pulled together, there's around about 8 designers that we managed to get in for that particular project, and it ran for about 6 weeks. And we're just so hungry. Every week there was 80 pages of sketch concepts done, and it was incredible. People are passionate, but we were just going above and beyond to try and win this competition. So at the end of this first project, we didn't win that particular concept round. However, we subsequently saw elements of the work that we'd done in some of the projects that came out, and then we're invited to the next project. And that's the one where we just absolutely cleaned up. That project, 2D concept, was chosen. It was slated for production and then executed by another studio that did have the full complement of alias and studio engineering. There's a vision behind all this and a roadmap of how we wanted to stage this out. Moving from advanced concept 2D work, the next step was to actually develop the studio engineering and the digital sculpting side of things. Digital sculpting, obviously, it's an absolutely key part of any project. That's when we started building out the digital team, and we were able to actually create proportion models and single theme models that would move us down a little further. And then over time, just the project started growing and growing to the point where we've completed a show car now for Vinfast, for our client, and also working on production work as well.
Do you guys have resources for clay modelling as well at GoMotiv?
I think every one of us loves clay modelling. We've all really grown up around clay modellers, and they're just the most highly skilled specialist people around. And there's a smell with the clay, and seeing the clay model in the studio and walking up to a physical model and touching it is amazing.
You make it sound very romantic.
A little bit ghost.
It is putting the love back into the car. That's what we always said. You know, you can do lots of digital modelling and all that sort of stuff, but there's something about cutting a clay model and then a clay modeler working it with their hands. It does put love into the surface, and you see it.
So when you're opening a ceramic studio, that's something for 2025.
That's right.
Redacted.
To the layman, the automotive industry has more or less left Australia, with General Motors, Holden, and Ford pulling out and downsizing, and Toyota not long after that. What are the challenges now that there is no manufacturing onshore with running a design studio, and what does that mean for the industry, the culture, and my love of utes?
Ford has still got a design studio here. Toyota's still got a design studio here. But with the big studios potentially downsizing and the decreasing manufacturing here in Australia from the automotive perspective, does put a real pressure on maintaining the talent here, but also the ability to train new talent and have younger staff come into a studio and learn from older, more experienced people on real programs. That's one challenge, is the retention of staff and the training of staff.
There's a bit of an ecosystem that needs to be maintained.
That's right.
Which obviously you can't rely on big corporations to do it for you. What does a training cycle look like when you take, let's say, a new grad and you want to bring him into Rhys level mastery?
I'll start answering that, and then Rhys can really answer it. With GoMotiv, one of the other things that we have done consciously is create junior positions within the team. The trick with doing credible car design is you do need experienced people. You can't just wake up one day and go, I'm going to do car design. You need to have the right people in the right positions. And the team that we've got at GoMotiv, seriously, it's one of the best I've ever worked with. And it's an absolute privilege. Within that team, however, we made a conscious decision early on to create some junior positions within the team because we wanted to make sure we were still developing some talent here. It also gave us depth in the team. And then it also gives our senior staff people to mentor and bring up, which adds to their enjoyment of their role and all those sort of things. It's been interesting. So with the programs that we've been completing, the junior staff now, I don't call them junior staff anymore. They are actually digital sculptors who have contributed to real programs. They are carrying their weight now, which is great. Obviously, they're not at the experience level that Rhys and his senior staff are, but one of the things we wanted to achieve was this pathway.
I started as an intern at Holden. That process, it was an amazing opportunity to jump straight from university level right into a working environment. I felt in that first 40-hour week that I was there, I'd basically learned more than I had in the previous 2 years of my degree. It was just an absolutely amazing experience. And it was a privilege to be able to do that. I understand that it's sometimes difficult.
And how are you bottling, replicating, and distributing that at GoMotiv with the new blood?
We try to do something similar in terms of that mentorship pathway. It's obviously going to be a little bit different because we're a smaller team, but I do rely quite heavily on a lot of my senior modelers to then provide that mentorship. And most of them had also previously gone through a similar process of that internship. So going back to those days, companies see that value in having those interns and being able to train them to the level where they're autonomous within the company. And they're all at that level now. They've still got a lot to learn. I would say I keep learning every single year as well. It's a never-ending process of development.
As a self-proclaimed lifelong learner, if I was a new starter, what were 3 pieces of advice you'd give to me on my first day?
That's a good one. Let me give you a moment to think.
There's no stupid questions. There's one, and always ask.
You need to be able to be reliant on other people, or you need to be able to feel comfortable enough in asking other people questions. In my experience, previously working at Monash as a lecturer and mentoring a number of interns even during that period when I was at Holden, I think the most valuable aspect is that ability to go and ask people questions and feel comfortable doing it and not stopping, I think, is another one. At a certain point, sometimes people get that confidence, but I think you got to feel like you can always ask people questions. Sometimes it's a case of feeling like maybe they're bothering senior staff, but I say, don't worry about that. Just ask the question. The worst case, somebody's going to say, I'm a little bit too busy at the moment. But I think in most cases, everyone tries to make an effort to go help juniors pull up their skill sets as well.
Design is never just done by yourself. You're always collaborating and asking questions. Even just when you're talking to people or around the office, you could realize something through a conversation. It never hurts to ask for help or get somebody else to have another set of eyes on something. I think it's always valuable, no matter how experienced you are.
Especially with digital sculpting in particular, where each sculptor has their own methods for building things. I think you'd find that if you sat down with a sculptor, they all approach it in a number of different ways. And even being exposed to that as a senior member of staff, often I find they've got a cool new technique for doing something. And that's the way you learn and build your own toolkit. And you find the things that work for you and the things that don't work for you. Okay, that didn't really work for me, but I like this thing, so I'm going to add it. That sort of becomes your skill set. You get better at doing certain things, I think, as well.
I'm very happy to ask a stupid question in a meeting. I quite often may know the answer, but I can sort of see that it needs to be asked so that you get that issue out on the table.
I know exactly how you feel. I walk into meetings all the time and I go, what's your spirit animal?
That's a good one. It's
a great way to break the ice.
Redacted. To stay up to date with the show, get in contact with us, and more, head to linktr.ee/redactedpod. Redacted.
What would you say would be the outer space or GoMotiv design process?
Obviously, at the start of any project, we want to try and understand where the client wants to go with what they're asking us to do. There might be an exploration phase or a bit of a journey we take them on looking at different elements of the project. Generally, with the automotive process, we are following a course-defined process. It's not that the process is fixed every time, but when we're building a program for a client, we're deciding, okay, given the time frame we've got, how do we execute that? How do we get from this point here, connect the dots to get over here? Following a course-defined process, we've had the privilege of drawing on our experience at GM or Ford or Toyota, where our staff have come. The process can be very dynamic depending on the client and the time constraints.
Can you give any examples on what you mean by that?
With GoMotiv at the moment, we are really doing things very efficiently, very fast. There's a lot of pressures on timelines from our clients, and I believe in the industry that's going to continue. The good thing with the way that we've set up is that we've set up with all the new tools. So VR, AI, all the tools we've got at our disposal. We're not encumbered by legacy hierarchies of how things are approved and what processes need to go through and then input from marketing and da-da-da-da. So it all hinges on how the client's set up and then how we can make a program work for them. Some of our production programs that we worked on might be 24 weeks from start to finish. That is insane, but in a good way. Whereas some of the places we worked in the past, that might be a 2-year process. What it means is the new entries, the new clients, the new customers that are coming out are getting fresh ideas to market really fast.
4 times the speed. It's like the Amazing Race.
Coming from that previous OEM background, when I started, a production program in the normal timeline was about 4 years from that first architecture study where they're just working out what the vehicle is, all the way to that final production line model. Whereas, as Rob just alluded to, one of our recent projects is under 12 months to do that entire stretch, which is crazy. And I think traditional OEMs are sort of moving in that direction. They're starting to cut down those timelines pretty significantly as well, because I think it becomes then a competitive aspect.
Do you not worry that it might turn into a bit of a race to the bottom with all these deadlines coming ever shorter?
There is a limit to how fast you can go because you do have to sync up with everything that manufacturing needs, everything that engineering needs. I don't think there's going to be a race to the bottom in terms of, hey, look, we must have this in X number of weeks or it's not going to happen. There is definitely an understanding that certain things have to happen in a process for it to be legit. There seems to be sort of a 2-speed somewhat. And that's where independent studios like GoMotiv, we are really offering clients speed and efficiency and high quality design.
Everything's going to look better than the Cybertruck.
No comment.
And when you're talking about the 24-week development process, if you break that down into smaller chunks, what are some of the steps in that journey?
All OEMs break down their process into what we would call gates, is basically deliverable dates that allow us, manufacturers as well, to understand, okay, here's the initial idea, even to go out to suppliers and manufacturers very early on and say, here's roughly what we're looking at. Can you start giving us an idea of what that's going to take to manufacture? It's different from company to company. We could probably break it down as maybe 3 primary gates where you first release an initial model and that goes out to engineering and they assess it. And then they do a loop of, okay, we've assessed the model. Here is a bunch of new criteria for you to refine it further. And then you do another release. That's your mid gate. And that goes out again. And then it's, okay, guys, we've worked all the kinks out of the system. Here's the final lot of criteria. Go away and make this model perfect. And that's the last step, especially for digital sculpting. And that's where the very technical aspect comes, where we start to refine the surfaces and highlight them. That's also done in conjunction with clay modelers in a larger OEM setting. And then you're like, okay, here's the final model. You give it off to the manufacturers, the suppliers, and then they go and actually make the vehicle. And that's its own length of time. So when we were talking about that 4-year process, the first 2 years of design, and then the next 2 years were typically engineering and doing things like safety testing, crash analysis,
Aero.
Yeah, everything. And you'll still do small tweaks.
And all of these individual teams like safety and manufacturing, the moment they finish what you've received, what they've received from you, they'll be receiving something else.
It's highly iterative. It's not like we're creating a surface and then handing that off and then hands up in the air and we're waiting. It's absolutely highly iterative. And that goes back to my point before. There's thousands of things that are coming at us all the time. And you've got to be able to cope with managing and juggling all those things.
We're dealing with what we call the A-class. And the A-class is everything the customer will see in a vehicle. And just to put that in perspective, when Rob's talking about thousands of things, just the interior alone in a typical vehicle can be upwards of 400 components. Every single one has to be modeled and designed. So every single one of those items will have a sketch associated with it, and obviously a CAD model and everything else that we've got to incorporate into that model for every single component. And that's just the interior of the vehicle. Then you got to deal with the exterior, and then you got to deal with variants, high level, low level variants.
And then someone might say, I don't like that.
You change one thing and it ruins all your constraints.
It's not like Microsoft Word.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not creating something and then it's in a box until the end. The clients are looking at it all the way along. And obviously you want to bring them on the journey and have their input and make sure that they're happy. It's a lot to juggle.
Redacted.
You're a small Aussie firm going head-to-head with the 100-year-old established European design firms like Pininfarina and Bertone, or venerable internal design departments at places like Ford, What's your comparative advantage and how do you plan to keep pace with the competition?
We're very hungry, absolutely hungry to do this work. We've got a lot of passion and that only goes so far. But what we're trying to do for every client is create brand defining design language for them and then really push that forward. We found that's worked pretty well so far. What we don't have is brand cachet for GoMotiv Studio. Hardly anyone knows about us, right? But once we start working with clients, they see the level of expertise the team's got, the level of passion every team member has got. Studio engineering, digital sculpting, or creative design, everyone is boots in and trying to actually do the best for that client. And they can see that. We've had comments like we feel like part of their own department. In terms of that side of things, we've got that nailed. But then in terms of process, we're always looking to optimize our process. With some of the first projects we did, we learned a lot from those and then changed. You don't just keep doing the same thing. We try and change. And some of the later projects we've been through where they're really complex and there's a lot of competing information, we're now changing our internal process to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Whether that's putting a specific gate review in or a period of time where we actually focus on just creating beautiful surface for a period of time without any inputs, we're building processes that will deliver those results. Tools is another thing. So obviously we're using VR and that's become a key to our process. So speed and developing some of the solutions to the tricky parts of the car.
We touched on the romance of car design.
Yeah.
You don't do clay modeling.
No.
Do you have a bit of an auteur flair? Or
We would love to do clay modeling. So it may be a matter of time, but we may use that in a different way. Currently, we've got the VR goggles on the desk. Designers are in it all the time. The digital sculptors are in it all the time. It's part of our daily process. It's not
accessory.
Yeah. There's not like a grand, we're going to do VR today. You know, it's there. It's all the time. That sort of speed and that efficiency is really, really good. Rhys, what do you think?
I think for the process side of things and improving that efficiency, we got to be a relatively lean team in terms of being multi-skilled as well, having people across multiple skill sets. And that's something, even if we look at larger organizations, they tend to focus those skill sets down a little bit. And that's why you find a niche. But being flexible allows us to put people in the right places and respond to clients' needs as quickly as possible without necessarily having to say, well, you only do this task. It's a case of, okay, everybody needs to feel like they can branch out. And it's not about forcing anybody to take on specific tasks. I think people find their own rhythm and the things that they're interested in. There are a lot of different skills to learn and build on.
And what about the romance or the internal branding of GoMotiv? When we talk about car design, people think about big halo cars like the Lancia Stratos or Toyota 86. Where's GoMotiv's soul going?
Obviously, we're going to be driven by the client expectation. We want to also be able to show that we can do things outside of that expectation and maybe explore avenues that exist outside of even just pure automotive design. I think there are opportunities that exist. A car is not just for those OEMs, but also for things like video games. That's an aspiration. I mean, these are vision level projects, but it's not necessarily something that's an active pursuit, but it's a case of what the client wants in terms of that vision. I think sometimes you have to compromise on that.
There's no internal concept cars that you're brewing up to advertise your capabilities?
There's probably not much we can actually talk about.
Maybe a little secretive.
There has been some things we've worked on in the past that have been internal.
There's enough passion within the organization that our designers are always looking to stretch their legs and do those concepts. And sometimes we have the ability to fit those in between some of those bigger jobs. We sort of do that for ourselves. Obviously, as Rob alluded to, we can't talk about some of those things, but I would say internally within the studio, there's enough passion to drive passion projects. And hopefully sometime in the future, you might see some of those down the line.
With our clients, we're hoping that, like our clients so far, that they've potentially got a big vision that they want to create. And if they're adventurous enough, that gives us space to create some amazing work. And we were lucky enough to work with Vinfast on the Vinfast Wild concept, which was revealed at CES. And that thing looks incredible. It's great.
We just had a look before and it looks amazing.
We'll have some images of it in the show notes. Robert, no one can see this because we're listening to your voice, but I can see a bit of a glint in your eye, like a little boy in the racetrack. There's something you want to talk about. Are there any Matchbox cars that you're working on or something?
Hot Wheels, my goodness. If we could just work on a Hot Wheels car, that'd be awesome. But no, there are real concept cars that we really would like to work on.
Come on, tell us, what's the dream?
Race cars would be nice, track cars. There's a few things in the background that we're always thinking about and potentially pitching.
Did you have any other transport projects that you wanted to talk about?
The skill set we've got from a A-class automotive can really be stretched across into other transportation segments. So anything that basically moves people or goods is where we can play.
Trams, trains and teleporters?
Yeah, trams, trains, buses, all that sort of stuff, which may not excite some people, but it's still solving problems and creating different designs that can push that mode of transport forwards. We're open to all those sort of things, but there are things that get us out of bed every day. That's the advanced concepts, advanced design, advanced concepts, the real blank sheet, blue sky kind of work. When we initially set this up, that was the space we thought we should be playing in, the smart end of design, given the background of skill set in Australia. That was something that people thought, hey, you can't do that in Australia. What are you talking about? But having lived overseas, and a lot of us having lived overseas, and then seeing the way design happens, we knew that we could do that here. The thing that we really are very strong at is advanced concept planning, looking for those gaps in markets or looking for those gaps in portfolios and helping clients discover where they may want to go next. I can't say that that's a race car. I can't say that that's a minivan. But finding those gaps and then helping the client actually explore that, that's a really exciting part, because that's going from this doesn't exist and these occupants don't sit in it this way. All those sort of different things can come into it. That's exciting for us. It may be that turns into a show car that is a pickup like the Vinfast Wild pickup, which has got an extendable bed, it's got a midgate and a lot of unique features to it. And it also pushes the brand styling forward. Or it may be a small city car, who knows? For a client wanting to actually create portfolios that win, that is key for them too. You can't just do Me Too cars.
You got to stand out from the crowd.
Exactly.
When you want to stand out from the crowd, do you have anywhere that you like leaning into? Any particular styles or visions that you find yourself coming back to at the moment anyway?
It depends on the client too.
Yeah, of course.
The brand language and the design language for a particular client is very important. Without that, the brand may not survive. If someone's creating an electric sedan and it looks pretty much, it's a handsome car, but it pretty much doesn't set the world on fire and it looks like everyone else's handsome EV.
It needs to have a soul.
Needs to have a soul, yeah, exactly.
You touched on somebody saying that you just can't do that in Australia. We do sometimes cover local culture. What would you say is the weaknesses of our local culture, but also what are its strengths?
The big idea was to design full cars here in Australia as an independent studio. There really has not been that before. There's certainly never been a studio that's been able to release or help a client release a show car and have that on the global stage. That had some initial
pushback.
Yeah, pushback, yeah. But again, like anything, you start small and you have a vision and you just work towards it. The first step for us was getting just an opportunity to actually sketch on a program. But the vision behind that was, okay, we really need to be doing full cars here. If the vision had been, oh, we're just going to design gear shifters or we're just going to design wheels, then that's only as far as you're ever going to go. You know that you're only going to start small. And then it's just a matter of how do you build that from that point.
Would you say that you've countered this very Australian notion of looking down on ambition with methodical, progressive, practical ambition? You've had a plan and you stuck to it.
Yes. And the other thing is we realise that it keeps on coming back to there is absolutely no reason why this shouldn't have been happening in Australia. The only downside is that it's extremely hard to do.
So there is a reason.
There is a reason. It's extremely hard to do.
Anything worth doing is difficult.
That is exactly right.
When there's potential clients overseas and pitch your ideas and you've gone for a tender, is there potentially a chance they look at that's an Australian company, why don't we go with a European company? Why don't we go with a US or Asian company or something like that? Do you think there's a disadvantage to maybe the reputation that Australia has in automotive design?
For different clients, we might pitch ourselves slightly different ways. It may be that we don't really hammer home, hey, we're Australian, because it doesn't really mean anything to a client overseas. All they want is that quality design that meets their expectations or exceeds their expectations. We're very careful about how we say who we are and what we do. And it all comes down to experience and proving that we've got the credentials to do what they need. That's the other thing too. When we started this whole thing, we flew under the radar for about 3 years. So no one knew what we were doing here in Australia. And that was intentional.
Intentional?
Absolutely intentional.
You wanted to be a submarine?
The reason was the vision was so large. We knew we had to build from day one, starting with small projects, gradually getting bigger. But what we didn't want to do was project what we're doing and then have everyone saying, hey, I can do car design. What we wanted to do was come out and say, hey, we do car design and we've done this, this and this. You should be working with us. That's the whole philosophy behind it. We didn't want to rely on, we do car design and I've got a GM background or I've got a Toyota background. That doesn't really speak to experience because the team is what is delivering this.
It's your actions that define you, not your history.
Exactly, yeah. So we wanted to be very careful about that and make sure when we're saying stuff, it's actually credible. Rhys built our current website. So the website's got some small bits and pieces on it. We're currently trying to update that, but it's been that very staged process. And even now we're a little cautious about saying too much, but obviously we're here talking a podcast, So
I mean, you may not like the next question then, because you've talked about a 3-year time period. Since then, what has been your biggest failure and what did you learn from it?
Failure is always a good place to start learning and evolving that process and refining it. During that first big project, we didn't have those processes in place or we didn't have those refined processes in place.
Is this the first 6-week sprint?
No, this would be the VFY when we sort of really ramped up and started to really build the team out. Prior to that, it was just the 3 of us. And then prior to that, even it was just JT and Rob. We've ramped up pretty significantly.
What happened? You had some growing pains?
When you have a company that's starting up, the OEMs, you look at them and sometimes think, well, that's a big beast. They've got all this process in place. You feel a little bit constrained in those systems. You feel like, why can't I just run as fast as I want to run? And I think my learnings, at least from that first big project, is sometimes there's a reason why those chains exist. Sometimes they make some sort of sense in order to help rein in the chaos. Because I think if everybody's running at full pelt, there's nobody there to pull people back a little bit.
So what happened to make you find out the hard way there should be a speed limit?
I won't go into exact details, but I think it's just a case of...
How many PDFs did you save as version 2, version 3, version 4?
When I was at GM, they had this big book of basically processes. 400-page book telling you at every stage of the process, this is what you need to do.
They had a Bible.
Yeah, basically. And you go through that and you very much understand what you need to do. And then I think when you start doing that for yourself, you're like, well, which ones do I want to keep? Which ones do I want to throw away? Which ones are going to make sense for us?
You had 400 commandments, but they didn't tell you why they exist.
Definitely understand why they exist. It was very clear at the end of the process that you understand why every single one of those commandments actually exist. I think it's a case of we want to be able to run a little bit freer,
be a little dynamic,
a bit more flexible than that system. That's why it's a learning process in understanding what failures we had in that process and which parts of that maybe we do want to crib into our process. Maybe just to help us refine that process a little bit without going full constraint in terms of how we develop our vehicles and how we push through those gates.
Yeah, there's always a sweet spot.
Yeah.
From my perspective, one of the biggest failures early on was I think we could have brought on some more experienced people much earlier to establish the team and establish the norms. And I think we held off a little too long. We've taken lots of risks as we've gone on with the big idea you've got to take risks. But we've been a little conservative sometimes to make sure that we're staging things and not taking on too much risk at once. Bringing on some key staff earlier may have been advantageous because they bring a lot to the team. And that's the other thing too. This is a team. It's not individuals. Having people on board who are part of the team early would have been a much better improvement, I think. And that would have led to, like Rhys was saying there, the process, developing some operating norms amongst us before we get thrown into coping with massive projects.
So if I was to summarize, your fellowship was missing Gandalf at a critical time.
They say becoming a car designer is harder than getting into the US MBA draft. What would you tell design students or professionals that want to get into the car design industry?
I think design just in general is a very competitive field going into it. I would say from my own experiences building that portfolio fresh out of high school, that was a very competitive process in terms of putting the portfolio forward and interviewing and comparing yourself to all these other high schoolers, even at that level. But when you're coming out to try and go into industry, I think it becomes even more competitive because at that point, people have found the things that at least interest them enough to really dive into their niches. There are a few things I think I would recommend. The first is that you need to look beyond the local scene for designers in terms of comparing yourself to the top schools overseas, like places like RCA, looking at their work, seeing what they're doing, looking at their portfolios and trying to compare yourself to that and where you sit and thinking, oh, they're my competition as well, even if they're not in your local market pool. The other one for me is to go out there and try and find at least an idea of what allows you to stand out.
Your unique selling point.
Yeah, your USP. What is it about you as a designer that lets you stand out in a crowd of portfolios? We see a lot of portfolios in the industry and they get into that point where they all look very similar to each other.
What was the last one you remembered?
For me, obviously, I was looking at digital sculpting portfolios. I think when we were at Holden, we saw a broader range, including designer portfolios. I know we're talking about designers, but even for digital sculptors, for me, where I saw it, and maybe just relating to designers, is that I saw a lot of SolidWorks models in portfolios from CAD perspective and almost no digital sculpting A-class surface models. And when I saw a surface model, even if it was not great, I'm like, okay, they've put themselves out there. They've actually pushed themselves beyond the rest of their cohort to go out and learn something they hadn't.
That goes immediately into the good pile.
Tip 1, learn alias.
For me, it allows me to identify somebody you can teach and somebody you can bring because they've got a passion to go out and do something beyond just their classwork or their own work. Just demonstrating that to a prospective interviewer is a good thing.
And what about the path of least resistance? Is there one of those?
For car designers in particular, the advice I got from an interior design manager at Holden was that he basically never saw interior design focused folios because I think everyone looks at car design, the exterior of car design.
It's the romantic part of the process.
Yeah, it's definitely the hero. Oh, look, I won't deny that. I think as we move into vehicles that are more focused, autonomous vehicles, things like that, where there's a greater focus on that comfort in the interior, we might see a switch to interior designers becoming the king. From an interior design manager point of view, looking at folios, they didn't see a lot of people who are passionate about interiors. Just get yourself in because you can move around a lot. Because it's such a big organization, you have opportunities to move into other roles.
To summarize, what you're telling me is your interiors manager would have 2 piles of portfolios and the one that would pass the interior guide was way smaller.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And it shows them that you've got a passion for something that not a lot of other students might have a passion for coming directly out of university.
But the reality is you spend most of the time inside the car and not gawking at it.
The interior designers are just so key and skilled at actually making functional components within the interior. But how do you actually make that look fresh and new and packaged correctly and all that sort of stuff? But interior designers, they're awesome and don't always get the credit that they are due, that's for sure. And you look at the show car that we did and the interior on that car is just amazing. And at the show, at CES, the doors were open probably 80% of the time.
With suicide doors, I might add.
Correct, yeah, because the interior was a star.
Speaking to some old veterans from Ford, I've heard that automotive designers were occasionally referred to as vampires. They had something to do with the lack of natural lighting in the studio.
I don't know who's referring to them as vampires, but...
Oh, so it is true.
It's the thing that I've heard, yeah.
Interestingly, the outer space GoMotiv situation is actually very similar to that, in that you go over to the outer space office and it's all bright, windows are open, you come over to the GoMotiv side. I don't think we ever have overhead lights turned on.
I get very upset because it's going to mean my plants are going to die.
Is that for just like supreme focus on the screen or color-wise?
Most of the designers have Cintiqs, so big monitors you draw on. And because those are on desks pointing up at the ceiling, overhead lights tend to then put glare on those surfaces. So they like having those lights turned off so they're not getting glare on their surfaces. For myself, it's a case of I do a lot of visualization work and color is really important. So when I have glare on my screen, color casted from lights, it's not great for me. So I tend to not want to have the lights turned on.
If I was a colorblind designer, would this impact my ability to have a career, or would you be able to work around it?
It might give you an edge.
Ooh, okay. I like the sound of that.
Just generally, it's a case of we just like that environment. It's a little bit darker, a little bit easier to see what's going on. We're very screen-based, and that screen direction facing up towards the ceiling. The glare is the biggest issue, I think, that you'll find in the studios.
Is this why you really want to bring Clay back into the office?
I get it. You get a bit of eye strain in the dark, sort of super focused.
I don't get eye strain at all. I think maybe it's just an adaptation that I've gotten used to having that system. But yeah, it's very unusual. Even in the bigger studios, you'll have all the desks with computers all in the dark, and then right next to it, you'll have this super bright Clay studio sitting right next to the desk. It's a very, very odd contrast.
In the Clay studio, it's all about reflections and seeing reflections. And then in the digital studio, you definitely don't want to see that on your screen.
In that old environment, would you put sunglasses on when you walk out into the Clay studio?
Those flip-up glasses.
I find them oppressively bright.
Has anyone told you look really young for a 200-year-old?
Yeah.
Rhys, you touched on interior, and I know interior, they have this 3-word phrase, color, material, finish. And it has definitely leaked into other industries. But what is the importance of color, material, finish in your work? And what's your process for implementing, iterating, and innovating with it?
Color, material, finish is the colors in the vehicle that can range from metallic colors all the way to Pantone colors. And then you have materials. That's the basics of materials. Old school cars with wood grain, but wood grains come back in the veneer format. And then finishes is the feeling on top of the surface. It's a case of there are very talented people who go out there and make it their life's goal to understand how customers are interacting with the vehicle, how that touch impacts the way that you perceive a vehicle as well. We have this niche of people who specialize in that.
That smooth touch of satin versus Egyptian cotton.
Satin or glossy or tactile touch within the interior as well. And each of those plays a key role in developing an experience for a customer when they're in a vehicle or even outside of the vehicle. And it also plays a key role in the perception of the vehicle. If you see a car with a lot of metal in the interior, I think you probably go, oh, this is a luxe vehicle. It's got real metal in it. It's not all plasticky. If you tap on plastic parts and it feels all scratchy, if you ever had that car keys in the pool cup and it's jittering around.
Which is weird because plastic is more expensive per kilo than metal.
When you're getting into that component level, we talked about there being over 400 components in a car. A metal component by itself is a bigger expense than potentially a plastic component.
With a big injection mold.
There's cost considerations. As we talked about, while it doesn't take much from the design aesthetics point of view, it doesn't really matter from that cost perspective. You can make a good looking car or a bad looking car or a conservative looking car.
At what point in the process would you consider color, material, finish?
Generally, it's done fairly early in the process. A, because it helps define what the manufacturer needs to spec in order to give you criteria about how those parts fit together. So it's really important to understand the gaps between objects. You want everything to come together. And there's limitations based on those materials as well. Certain materials are going to mean that you have to build things in a certain way, and you want to know that information as early as possible.
What kind of limitations are we talking about here?
Something like leather obviously is going to need a seam of some sort. You're going to have to work out how to wrap it around the geometry of the part. But when you're making the model, you got to think about, well, when they build that object, they have to actually shrink it by a certain amount. They have to shrink it by the width of the leather. And then the leather makes up that final thickness on the object. When you're constructing and interfacing it into other components, you've got to take that material thickness into consideration, how it interacts with an object sitting next to it.
And what about how that material and that color will change over time? Will it get those esteemed gray hairs in its beard?
That's an engineering level question because they go off and sit there with machines that rotate around thousands of times to test how durable a piece of leather is or how much the plastic's going to wear. As a small example of that, the plastics in a vehicle might have different textures on top. Some of those are functional. So sometimes when it has a very deep texture, that helps with the wear and tear because the scratches that get on the surface.
It's like the glove box. If you've got a bag that scratches it.
Yeah. That helps with that perception as well, because if you have a material in a high wear zone that doesn't hold up to that, very quickly somebody's car starts to feel perceptually like, hey, well, my car doesn't feel as nice.
What about if a car is maturing? I know with a lot of old school wood grain, the wood grain wasn't perceivable when the car is brand new, but over time you can see the knots in the wood as the dye fades off with the ultraviolet. Do you think about that sort of thing and how this car is going to mature into its gentlemanly era?
Based on my interactions, I guess, with CMF people, they will build you PDF documents that go into great details about the materials they're trying to put on that vehicle, and they will go to great lengths to research exactly what's going to happen, exactly how that material is going to mature. And sometimes there is a goal to have that patina occur if you know the material is going to patina. Generally, that's on higher lux vehicles where you want that to mature in a specific way. And we know things like leather obviously break in over time and they become softer and more pliable, and that adds to the experience. They go into very great detail and research that. Like I said, it's a very specific niche, and that's all they do. That's all they care about.
And they don't live in the dark room, do they?
No, they love the light. In fact, they have a special light specifically for being able to view colors in their most pure, true form. We're in a room right now with some overhead lights, probably with an orange tint to them. Sometimes in that color spectrum, you go from a red all the way to blue in light, and finding true neutral light is actually difficult. They build special machines just to go off and make sure they're seeing that color in its most neutral possible version. And then they'll go and look at it across the spectrum of light and go, okay, this is what it's going to look like sitting outside in daylight. This is what it's going to look like sitting in somebody's garage. And are we happy with how that perceptual value looks in those different light environments?
I'm learning a lot. We're really diving into the nuts and bolts.
That's when you specify it. But then when you're actually getting into production, there's a whole other process to make sure that what you specified is actually being made in production and matched.
This isn't my Pantone. I wanted the perfect Pantone 126 blue.
This is Robert Thorpe.
This is Rhys Kaunda-McKenzie.
And you're listening to
Redacted.
Rhys and Robert, thanks so much for joining us on Redacted Podcast. It's been really insightful for all of us, and we're really keen to see what you guys bring up soon.
Awesome. Well, thank you. You can come visit us anytime.
When are you opening this clay studio?
We've got a space in mind.
I'll be there for the opening night, as long as I get some time on the kiln.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a pleasure. It's always great to exchange ideas.
And be sure to check anything from the show notes, especially the latest in GoMotiv automotive design. Until next time, this has been REDACTED.
The number you have dialed has not been recognized. Please check and try again. The number you have dialed has been...
Redacted.